Perfect. I think we can get started until we wait for the others to join us. Um, yeah, Gemma, you can let the participants into the room.
Yep.
Okay, welcome. Welcome everyone to the 9th session of our series, Navigating Rare Disease Research. Thank you so much for joining us today. As usual, before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping reminders. First, a reminder that today's session is being recorded, and both the slides and the recording will be available on the training page later today, so you'll be able to revisit them anytime. We also encourage you to participate actively today. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time, or if you'd like to speak up, just raise your hand and we'll do our best to get to you during the Q&A. Also, it's important to sign the attendance sheet that will be linked in the chat in a second. As I mentioned, is it essential to complete the training and receive your certificate? So please make sure you fill it out before the end of the session. And yeah, let me introduce you to today's speakers. We are joined by two experts in the field of ethics and research today. We have Petra Wilson, Managing Director at Health Connect Partners, who you know from the previous webinar, and Annalisa Landi, researcher at Gianni Benzi Pharmacological Research Foundation. And today's topic is all about ethics and informed consent, a crucial aspect of conducting research responsibly, especially in the context of rare diseases. And Petra and Annalisa will delve into the importance of obtaining ethics approval in research and how to navigate the informed consent process, including considerations for pediatric assent forms. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Petra to kick things off. And Petra, the floor is yours. You can start sharing your slides.
Thank you very much. So it's nice to be with you again. I'm actually going to just be doing a little piece of this webinar because I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the legal issues around ethics and informed consent, but the majority of the time will be taken over by my colleagues Annalisa and Onato, who will be looking particularly at the issues around research, consent, and particularly then again on children in research. Can we have the next slide, please? So here you can see what we're going to do, a little bit of background, ethics, informed consent, then informed assent, being different from consent, and then young voices in clinical trials. And can we have the next slide, please? The first thing I just want to have here as a general introduction is that consent is both a legal and an ethical concept, and we are going to be looking at both the legal and the ethical concepts. There is national and EU law that defines the different forms of consent for taking part in studies, in trials, and for receiving healthcare. And one of the complexities for researchers and healthcare practitioners in this field is that you do need to be aware of the law in your own country. And then if you're going to do anything across borders, you do need to be aware of the law in the other countries as well. On top of legal requirements, there are also the requirements when we come to research of national and regional healthcare ethical committees or research committees. They will have different names in different countries. And whilst there is no EU level ethical committee as such, if you're doing EU level research, you will have to provide ethics committees consents from each country in which you're going to do research. And there is an overarching EU ethics committee, but it's really for people, for ethics committees at the EU level to get together and talk rather than for a particular study to be approved. So we're going to be hearing about a mixture of European and some national level issues, and you're also going to be hearing about legal and ethical issues today. So let me kick off with talking a little bit about the ethical issues. And if I have the next slide again. So I've given you here on the right-hand side of the slide a book which is by many people thought to be the baseline of ethics in any research issues, and actually also ethics in healthcare provision. It's Beecham and Childress by Principles of Biomedical Ethics, now in its 6th edition. It was originally published in 1980, and it is still the standard textbook and standard guidance for ethics in research. And that also does extend to ethics in care provision. And the 3 core principles that we can take from Beecham and Childress are set out here. They are the duty or the ethical principle of respect for the person, the ethical principle of beneficence, which means to do good or at least to do no harm, and the ethical principle of justice. So with respect to the ethical principle of respect for persons, that is really all built around the idea of autonomy and privacy, the idea that every individual has the right to be in control of their own body and, as far as possible, in control of their own destiny. And autonomy is very much the principle, the ethical principle, which is linked to what we're going to talk about in more detail, which is consent. It is the right to be autonomous, the right to say what you want to have done to your body or done with your data, which is central to the idea of consent, and it's all built on the principle of autonomy and respect for persons. The respect for persons also includes the more legal duty of privacy, the duty to protect the interests and privacy of an individual. And we will talk today about privacy in care itself, privacy in research, and privacy of data. So there's quite a lot more legal stuff around privacy than there is around autonomy, which is reflected in law, but has a stronger base as an ethical principle. Beneficence and non-maleficence are firmly lodged in the Hippocratic Oath, which guides treatment, and also in the conventions on research. And it means that wherever possible, the duty of a healthcare professional, whether treating a patient or a researcher doing research, is to do good or at least do no harm. And in healthcare, the at least do no harm part is obviously rather stronger than in research. The idea is that all healthcare should aim to do good, but obviously in some cases healthcare can do harm. We give very noxious substances when we give chemotherapy, for example, and every surgical intervention carries with it the potential risk of harm. So the overriding duty is to do good, but it is also this principle of non-maleficence, which is the top element of the Hippocratic Oath, which in Latin is primum non nocere, first do no harm. And then the third element is justice. In healthcare, justice is very much around the fair allocation of resources and the avoidance of unfair bias. That is to ensure that when healthcare resources are scarce, as they usually are, whether that's in terms of physical resources, people, time, or medicines, that those are allocated as fairly as possible, and that unfair bias is avoided so that we guard against not giving treatment to people of a particular age or gender or background. But this is a really difficult concept because, of course, the duty to do good, the beneficence, and the duty to act fairly, justice, have to be balanced together. And sometimes if your duty is to do good, that means you might have to favor a particular patient group, the patient group most likely to benefit. So sometimes countries can both ethically and legally make a decision not to treat patients over a particular age or with particular comorbidities, and that will not be unethical, but there will have to be good reasons for why those decisions are made. When whole courses are taught on medical ethics. I've given you, I can't even see now, but a few minutes of background on what ethics in research and ethics in healthcare are. And all I really want you to do is to keep these three principles in mind. The book that's depicted on the right-hand side is about 400 pages long. And as I said, there are people study this for years and years. So I would hate you to leave by thinking that this one slide teaches you everything that you need to know about ethics in either healthcare or in research. But that's all we're going to do on it today. And we are going to have questions later. So I'll stay on to the end in case there are questions around this. May I have the next slide, please? So what we're going to talk about now, and I'm going to talk about consent in healthcare, and that is different to consent in research. And consent in healthcare is both an ethical and a legal concept. And the ethical principles are very much based on those that I've spoken about just now. It is the fact that our bodies are our own spaces and we have control over them. And therefore, ethically, we have to have consent to touch another's body. However, one of the big issues is that sometimes, in order to act ethically, so particularly as a healthcare professional, to act ethically to prevent harm to a patient, we may have to touch somebody without their consent because they might not be physically or mentally able to give consent. So although generally speaking, consent must always be obtained ethically in order to touch a person and treat them, it is not an absolute rule. However, if we are relying on consent and we are saying that we are touching or treating a person because they have consented, then that consent must be informed, and it must be the person consenting must be able to understand what they're consenting to. And that consent must also be freely given. They must not be coerced into giving the consent. If consent is not freely given, it doesn't count as consent, either ethically or legally. And then if a treatment is ongoing, so rather than being a one-off intervention, if it's an ongoing treatment, it must also be possible for a patient to withdraw their consent without fear of repercussions. So, for example, you may begin on a therapy, and it might be that after a time of that therapy, you decide that the burdens of it on yourself or on your family are too much and you want to withdraw your consent, but you still want to get the care of the healthcare professional. It must be possible to withdraw consent. Now, those ethical principles are also reflected in law. And they are reflected in national level law. As I've noted at the bottom of this slide, there is no EU law on consent in healthcare as such. This is regulated in national laws, and it will vary, particularly with respect to children's consent and implied consent. Excuse me. The one thing that I would really want you to take away from this, however, is that when we come to be talking about research after this slide, consent in research has to be explicit and informed. It can't be implied. You can't just assume that somebody is consenting to research, to be part of a trial, for example. But in healthcare, actually, usually care is provided on the basis of an implied consent. That is a consent that you can draw from the context in which the patient and the healthcare professional are interacting. It's not something that necessarily requires a signature. So, for example, if you go to a healthcare professional and they say they would like to take a blood sample and you roll up your sleeve, that can be taken as an implied consent to taking the blood sample. However, you do, now going back to the informed piece on the other side, the person does need to know what that blood is going to be tested for. And if it's going to be tested for something that may not be treatable or that may have wide-reaching implications, like, for example, HIV test, then it is usual that consent has to be formally required. But these are things that vary from country to country. Also, sometimes, as I've already said, in order to act ethically as a healthcare professional to save somebody's life, for example, you may have to treat when they're not able to give consent. They may be mentally incapacitated, they may be unconscious, and in that case, again, consent is not even assumed, it is simply waived, because the healthcare professional needs to intervene to save the patient. And then there is also the issue of children. I will come into that much more in the context of research, but generally speaking, in most European countries, children cannot consent to their own medical treatment. It has to be their parents or somebody in the position of the parent who has to consent for them. What becomes difficult is that the concept child is not uniform across all European countries, and it's not uniform across all areas of law. So whilst, for example, you might be a child until you're under 18 for the purposes of voting or for driving a car, in many countries, the concept of consent of a child arises when the child is deemed mentally competent and able to understand what they're consenting to. Now, in some countries, this is fixed legally, and in other countries, it's left up to the healthcare professional to assess whether a particular child is able to consent. And with that, I hope I've given you a little bit of a background of what consent is as an ethical concept in healthcare, as opposed to research that we'll come onto in a moment. But before we come on to research, I want to talk a little bit about consent to data within healthcare, consent to data processing within healthcare and within healthcare research. So if I could have the next slide, please. The EU General Data, it says DARA protection, my spelling mistake, General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, requires that a legal basis exists for processing data. And there are two different types of legal bases, whether one, and you've got that on the left-hand side, if it is non-sensitive data. So, for example, your name, your address, your telephone contact details, even data like whether you have children, that is usually conceived of as general data, for which one of these 6 legal bases for collecting that data has to exist. And you can see consent is one of them. And then if you want to collect sensitive data, and healthcare is generally regarded as sensitive data, you also need to have one of these other legal consents. And you can see that they are similar. So for example, we've got consent and explicit consent, we've got public interest and substantial public interest. So in some cases, it's just a little bit more, you have to be a little bit more thorough about how you get the consent. But there are also some differences. And the one that I really want to draw your attention to is on the right-hand side, you can see healthcare provision. Generally speaking, consent to collecting data in healthcare is not required. It's not the legal basis. So, and the reason for that is, in order to conduct yourself properly, legally and ethically as a healthcare professional, you need to keep proper records of the care that you're giving the patient. Therefore, you have to collect data. So your legal basis for collecting data in healthcare is usually healthcare provision. It's not usually consent. In some countries, it is also sometimes contract is used, particularly in private healthcare, where a contract, an explicit contract, exists between a healthcare professional and a patient. And in some countries, the legal basis of legitimate interest is used. But in a study that was done in 2018, in fact, just before the European Health Data Space Regulation was drafted, I was part of a study where we investigated in all 27 countries what was the usual legal base for collecting data in healthcare. And in fact, only one country at that point gave consent as their usual legal basis. All the others used either healthcare or in some cases contract. However, that is all very different when we talk about doing research. And in research, what you will see is for the general data, so your data about things like names and addresses and so forth, you're going to be using consent. And when you're collecting sensitive data, you're going to be using the explicit consent, and my colleagues will talk much more about what explicit consent is and how you get that. And you're also going to have to rely on national law around scientific research and demonstrate that the research that you're doing may be justified by explicit consent. And that links us back into the research ethics committees. The one big difference about using data for research purposes between what you've got here in GDPR, so that might be for conducting a clinical trial. So for conducting a clinical trial, you're going to have explicit consent, and you're going to have a legal basis in your home country. Once that clinical trial has been done, that data may be reused, and this is what I talked about last time, may be reused for further research without explicit consent under the European Health Data Space Regulation. Under the European Health Data Space Regulation, if you remember, the patient has a right to withhold their consent, to say they want to opt out of their data being used for research purposes, but explicit consent is no longer required for the reuse of that data, but it is always required for the original collection of the data. And that's what Annalisa in particular is going to talk about next. So I'm going to hand over to her.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Petra. So, and thank you for the introduction. As already anticipated by Petra, the informed consent should be considered as a dynamic and continuous process, which begins when we have the recruitment of the subject, but does not end with the signature of the subject. So we can imagine a process that starts with the provision of information to the participants, then the comprehension of the information must be checked, and we have the voluntary decision. But after the voluntary decision, the comprehension must be monitored and maintained, and when we have new information, the consent should be refreshed. The informed consent main features are included in this slide. The consent should be freely given, informed, clear and comprehensive, transparent, explicit, and also easy to withdraw. The informed consent, according to the Helsinki Declaration, is the willingness of the individuals capable of giving this choice, this informed consent, to consent to the research, to a research study with no in a really easy and easy way. So with reference to the informed consent, as already said by Petra, we have the differences between the informed consent coming from the GDPR and the informed consent for the research purposes. So with reference to the informed consent definition included in the clinical trial regulation, the informed consent means the subject's free and voluntary expression of the willingness to participate in a study, but this may happen following the he or she has been informed of all the aspects of the study. And also, in case of minors, the authorization of the parents or legally designated representative to include them in the clinical trial. We need to distinguish this definition from the definition of the informed consent coming from the GDPR as one of the legal bases for the data processing activities. So the informed consent under the clinical trial regulation must not be confused with the notion of consent as a legal basis for the processing of personal data under the GDPR. And beside the consent to the research, the participants must provide also the consent to the processing of their personal data. And the lack of consent to the data processing may compromise for sure the participation in the study. This concept has been clearly described and defined in one of the guidelines released by the European Data Protection Board. With the reference to the minors, the clinical trial regulation states that when we have a minor who is capable of forming an opinion and assessing the information provided to him or to her, the minor shall also assent in order to participate in a clinical trial. And we have also information related to the assent coming from the Helsinki Declaration and the ICH GCP, the Guideline for Good Clinical Practice. In the Declaration of Helsinki, it is clearly stated that the physician must seek the assent in addition to the consent of the legally authorized representative, and also the dissent should be respected, while the ICH GCP states that the age-appropriate assent information should be provided to the minor participant and discussed with him or with her as part of the informed consent process, and assent should be obtained as appropriate. So it is important to highlight that information must be adapted to the age and the mental maturity of the minors. They must be provided by researchers, investigators, or members of the investigating team that are experienced in working with children. And the explicit wish of a minor to refuse the participation in the study or to withdraw from the study must be respected by the investigator. In this slide, you can see the different rules in the pediatric research. So we can consider the pediatric population children between the birth and 18 years old. A minor is defined instead as a person who has not reached the legal age to give informed consent. But we have also another figure that is the emancipated minor. He or she is able to give informed consent legally under national law, but the vulnerability is to be considered. And we have the legal representative or the parents who have the power to give informed consent on behalf of the incapacitated person, or in this case of a minor. It is important to highlight that there are different, that we have the assent as defined as the minor's declaration of willingness to participate in a study, and this is a legal value according to the national law. The child must accept to participate in a study, while we have the agreement that it is similar to the assent, but it is not required by law. It is important to note that in the ethical consideration for clinical trials on medicinal product conducted with minors, it is strongly recommended to seek the assent of the child even when it is not mandatory by law. We have also to define the dissent, the explicit will of a child capable of expressing the opinion to refuse the participation or to withdraw from the study. And here we also need to consider what happens when we have these differences of opinion. First of all, every effort should be made to understand and respect the differences of opinion between the child and his or her parents, legally designated representative. The doctor, the investigator, or the person in charge of the trial and of the informed consent process should try to reconcile these differences. If they remain in disagreement, the dissent of any of the parties is decisive. The minors agreement, notwithstanding, we need to say that the minors agreement is not sufficient to allow the participation in a clinical study, and it should always be supplemented by the informed consent of the parents' legally designated representative. Another aspect that we need to consider when we discuss the minors' participation in research is the period, the adolescence period, when they reach the age of legal competence to give informed consent. In this case, in the clinical trial regulation, it is clearly stated that if during a clinical study or clinical trial the minor reaches the age of legal competence, a new informed consent shall be obtained by the minor that is now an adult, a legal adult. It is important also when we have new information related to the study, also to reassess the assent of the child, also considering the recognition of their advancing age, evolving maturity, and competencies. With reference to the informed assent, we need to talk about the different age groups. So we have the newborns and infants and the preschoolers, for which only the consent from the parents' legal representatives is to be sought, while we have the schoolers, for which also the assent is to be sought, and the adolescents one, that is a group treated differently across member states. In detail, with reference to the newborns and the infants, it is not possible for sure to obtain the agreement from them, and also the understanding of the research is not expected from them, but for sure we can provide them with information related to the procedures that they are going to have during the study. And also we need to consider any sign of resistance or protest from them. With reference to the preschoolers, they are the young children from 2 until 5 years of age with an emergent capacity to provide agreement, but they are not mature enough to express the assent to participate in a study, even though the expression of resistance should be valued and discussed with the parents. There is also a need to provide them with information in a different way. We have then the schoolers with a growing capacity to provide agreement, and the information can be provided by making use of visual strategies such as videos, cartoons, drawing, and so on. And the children should be well informed, and the agreement is to be obtained preferably in writing, and the distance should be respected. With reference to the adolescents, it is a very sensitive group that is treated differently across member states, and we need to sought and respect the agreement from them. since they may have the capacity to make adult decisions or independent judgments in many areas of life. However, they can also ask the support from their parents' legal designated representatives in the informed consent process. As already anticipated, some member states can consider that the adolescents above a certain age are no longer considered minors and have the legal competence to give informed consent for the participation in the research, while in other member states the national law requires the assent from all or part of this group. So we have also to consider the cases of emancipated minors that can provide, for example, consent instead of assent. So the different considerations on this age group are included in the ethical consideration for clinical trials document. With reference to the contents of the informed assent, it is important that we have age-appropriate information adapted to the language skills and understanding of the child. As said before, also the use of visual strategies is to be encouraged, using cartoons, pictures, drawings, and so on. The differences, cultural differences should be considered, and where appropriate also the investigator should arrange for translation. The information to be included in the informative material for minors in the informed assent is related to the study procedure. So what are we doing? What are you being asked to? Why you have been asked to participate in the study? How long is the study going to take? And other simple information. But also we need to share with them information about their privacy. So it is important to highlight that the GDPR does not contain specific provisions for children in the context of scientific research. Nevertheless, privacy information should be set up for children and should be provided with a clear and appropriate language and in a friendly way. So we need to explain them why personal data are required, what will be done with the personal data, the rights that they have over the personal data, and the type of safeguards measures that will be adopted to prevent the risk of data breach, unauthorized data access. It is important that additional protection is to be granted to personal and sensitive data coming from children, since they are less aware of the risks and consequences of their data sharing or data use and of their rights. So it is important to provide them with information in an easy, accessible way and using clear and plain language. So I have included in these last 2 slides quick tips related to the contents of the informative material for minors, the informed assent, and so, for example, to promote the simplicity and the clarity of information, for example, using bullet points or making the explanations short and concise. To use simple and lay terms, avoid any technical terms, and emphasize important words, using, for example, the bold or underline the text. We can also use the pictures, in particular when we have complicated procedures that should be explained to children, to minors, and for example using maps also to indicate the study's physical location, and also include colors, for example the use of red, green and blue that are considered great choices for emphasizing important sections, avoid color combination and so on. And the last but most important thing according to our experience is to seek advice from children or young persons advisory group when you are in the process of creating informative material for minors. So thank you. I handed my part and I will leave the floor to Emanuela to continue with this. I stopped the sharing.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Today I will give a brief description of empowering young boys in clinical trials, and in particular some activities of TEDI, the European Network of Excellence for Pediatric Research. So on the based on the right of child, as written on the Article 12 Convention on the Rights of the Child, states parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the rights to express those views freely in all the matters affecting the child, the use of the child being given weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child, and the Article 24, the Charter, the right of the child, they may express their views freely. Such views shall be taken into consideration on matters concerning them in according with their age and maturity. On basis of these articles, TEDI promotes pediatric research that considers the persistent unmet therapeutic needs and priorities children's well-being and safety. TEDI Kids have a voice in TEDI Board of Directors with one kids representative appointment by their kids as outlined in the TEDI statute, and with the aim to empower children and young individuals by incorporating their perspective in health related decision making is a fundamental right. So TEDI supported the TEDI Kids network that include young persons advisory groups across whole Europe focused on pediatric health, and it empowers children in clinical research, ensuring their voice are heard throughout the process. In particular, TEDI support support the creation of new IPAG across Europe. So the mission of promoting children's rights and active participation in the decision-making process reached a milestone when the TEDI Kids from Albania, France, Greece, Italy, Latvia, and Malta collaborated with the Council of Europe to develop the guide to participation of children in the decision-making process regarding their health, released in 2023. The Council of Europe has developed the child-friendly version of the guide through a participatory methodology involving children and adolescents from all over the EU, including members of the TEDI Kids network from Kids Bari and Kids Albania. So here you can see a video about
We cannot hear the sound, I suppose.
No, maybe if you can try sharing again and clicking the share sound button.
Sorry?
If you can stop sharing and click the share button again on your slides.
Okay.
If not, I can do it for you.
One moment, because I think maybe in this.
I'll do that. No worries.
No.
No, stop sharing. Sorry, I didn't know.
Okay, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. Do you see it in full screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, it happened to us too.
When I was sick, I was scared. I did not understand what was happening. I did not speak.
No one asked me anything. Adults told me what to do. They say it was to make me feel better and protected.
Do you know you have the right to be informed about what is happening to you? You have the right to be heard and express your own opinion. Giving your views about your health is important for adults. Remember, you have to be aware of what is happening to you to form your opinion and express it.
Adults should listen what you say, and they should help you to understand things about your health.
Yes, you have the right to participate in all decisions regarding your health. Your opinion is important and must be taken into account. Adults must listen to what you say to understand what you feel.
Remember, adults don't always think like you. If they take different decisions, you can ask why. They should provide explanations.
Children are encouraged to take part in decisions affecting their own life and their health.
Making decisions about health requires practice and information. The more informed you are, and the more you stand up and speak, the more you will understand how best to express your opinion.
Participating means getting your voice heard and working with adults to reach decisions together.
Participation is your right, though you can choose not to express your opinion if you prefer. Information is key to helping you from your opinion.
Okay, and there is another video during the FP6 funded project TEDDY, Task Force in Europe for the Drug Development of the Young. A collection of short videos was created explaining to children different health-related concepts and words, including why medicine for kids are different and what fever or antibiotics actually are. So there is the next video. Can you, okay.
Hi there. Here we are in the doctor's surgery. His name is Dr. Pill, and he's a paediatrician, a doctor for kids. He's going to be talking to you about paediatric medicines, which are medicines made especially for younger boys and girls. Kids are different from adults, so they need different medicines. even though kids are smaller. That doesn't mean that all you have to do is just take a little bit less of the adult medicine. A kid's body hasn't completely developed. As you grow, you turn into an adult, and your body learns to work in a different way. That's why medicines for children have been designed to be different from adult ones. Every now and then, you might get sick, and you might need some medicines to help you get better. These two brothers have both got a temperature. A high temperature is one of the ways the body defends itself against germs, tiny animals which attack the body and give it diseases. Your body defends itself by raising its temperature to help get rid of them. The problem is, if your temperature is too high, it can make you feel awful. That's why you sometimes need to take some medicine to help the body cool down. The medicine helps the body to get rid of the extra heat, by sweating for example. When your doctor prescribes the medicine, he writes down how much you need to take, for how many days, and how many times each day. The dose, the amount of medicine you need to take, depends on your age and weight. There are so many different types of medicine, and the doctor will choose the best one for you. Tiny children can't take pills and tablets because they haven't learned to swallow properly yet. So for them, drops and syrups are much easier. If a kid has been vomiting, it's not a good idea to give a medicine by mouth. It could just come straight back out before it has time to help your body. Or if you have diarrhea, it's best to avoid suppositories. Taking medicines is important to help you get better. For example, antibiotics help you fight against bacterial infections and need to be taken regularly at the same times, once or more a day, depending on the infection. If that doesn't happen, the bacteria might just get stronger and stop the antibiotic from working. So, make sure you take the antibiotic only if your doctor tells you to. Make sure you don't interrupt the treatment, even if you think you're better, and make sure you take the right dose for the right number of days. Medicines need to get into your body if they're going to make you better. There are different ways of taking a medicine. When the medicine is a tablet, or a syrup, or some drops, it gets into the body through your mouth and goes down to your tummy. It then goes through the walls of your stomach and gets into the bloodstream. This process is called absorption. Some medicines, called suppositories, actually go into your body through your bottom. The medicine then gets into your bloodstream through the walls of your intestine. Medicines can also be given by injection, which helps them get into your bloodstream really fast. Some medicines are put straight onto the part of the body that's having problems, like skin creams, eye drops, ear drops, or nasal drops, that's for your nose. But there are also other medicines which need to get to parts that are deep inside your body, like the parts you use for breathing, your nose, your throat, your windpipe, and your lungs. When you take one of these medicines, first it's nebulized in an aerosol. That means it's turned into tiny droplets, which can reach your windpipe and lungs without going through your tummy or your blood. After the medicine has helped your body get better, it comes out of your body again in your poo, your wee, and your sweat.
Okay, so also in the context, so maybe you can go in the next.
Go to the next slide. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So also in the context of the age-appropriate informative materials that the network has contributed with the video, with videos designed to inform children about the clinical trial. So you can. Okay, thank you.
The mystery of the clinical trial. Today, we'll try to unravel one of the biggest mysteries ever for children of all ages. What is a clinical trial? Shall we investigate, Bunsen? When doctors want to know whether or not a medicine works well, there is only one way to find out. By trying it out with loads of different people, and this is called clinical trial. All children who take part in the trial are divided in two groups. However, in order to try the medicine out, it should only be given to people who actually need it. Is there anyone who needs it in here? Found him. The two groups of children in the trial each take a different medicine. The first group takes the new medicine. The second group takes a medicine that is already known to work and is already given to children. By comparing their effects, we can see whether the new medicine also works. During the trial, the doctors always give the children checkups to make sure that all is fine and dandy. A clinical trial can last a few days or several months. By the end of the trial, the doctors know whether or not the medicine works. Bunsen, the medicine doesn't work right away. Sometimes it takes a while to kick in. Occasionally, it doesn't work at all. And sometimes it works really well. And yet, even if the medicine works well, sometimes it might cause a few problems. There is no reason to worry, though. If a problem does appear, the doctors will always try to make it disappear in the twinkling of an eye. If the clinical trial works, many children like you will be able to take the new medicine and feel much better. This is it, Bunsen, old pal. Drop it. We'll touch down again in a bit, my friend. But before that, there are a few more deliveries we should make. What do you mean? Where? All over the world, Bunsen. All over the world.
Okay, there is the last one. What is a clinical trial?
A clinical trial is a research project where large numbers of patients volunteer to test whether a drug works and is safe. This only happens once the medicine has passed many safety tests and doctors feel comfortable giving it to their patients. The patients who take part in a trial are divided into two groups. Randomly selecting the patients who will be in each group makes the groups as similar as possible. The first group takes the drug that needs to be studied. The second group takes another drug which is already known to be safe and effective for the same condition. Sometimes knowing that you are taking a medicine is enough to make you feel better or worse. To avoid this, the patients don't know which medicine they are taking. And to avoid their judgment being influenced, the doctors don't know either. A study can last several weeks or several months. All the way through the study, doctors check how well the drug is working and if there are any problems caused by taking it. The medicine may work very well for some patients, but may take a long time or not work at all for others. While taking the medicine, the patients may also experience problems that are not related to their condition. These are called side effects. For this reason, doctors conduct frequent checkups, both in person and over the phone, and give them special care. At the end of the study, the doctors are able to determine whether the new drug is as safe and effective as the old drug, or maybe even more so. If the new drug is safe, effective and perfectly okay, many more patients will be able to take it.
Okay, the development of age-appropriate informative materials, in this case, the creation of tailored materials to inform children and their families about the key concept of drug and their use in clinical trial. And here there are some examples about this age-appropriate informative material in the context of DEEP and GAP project. So the next slide, please. You can, okay. In the context of the project, this project aimed to integrate the existing information on the ferriprone using pediatric population with the chronic iron overload. And in this context, the created some informative materials for children. In the next slide, please. So you can see booklet and okay, the next slide. Okay. The summary. Okay, there are some examples, and also here there are some examples of this informative material in the GAP project. This project aims to develop and test a new formulation of gabapentin for the treatment of neuropathic chronic pain in pediatric population. And also in this context, Teddy created some information materials, okay, booklet and okay, and assent form. There is an example. So thank you. Okay. I can not hear you.
Sorry, I'm muted. I was reading some of the questions in the chat because I was sharing the slides. I couldn't look at the chat to see if there were any messages. Now is the time to ask questions to Annalisa and to Petra and to Emanuela. So if anyone would like to share their experience or ask a question, you can put it in the chat or you can raise your hand. I see a comment from Elena regarding the videos. She's asking, are these videos translated to other languages other than English?
Okay. No, but we make them available to translation. At this moment, we have this video only in English.
Okay. Then Elvina is asking, how should consent processes adapt in the context of digital health? Petra, maybe you want to take this one?
I'm not 100% sure I will know the whole of your question, so you can come back with more if you want to. But in a digital health context, if you are not seeing a patient face to face and you want to involve them in a study, or you want to involve them in a telemedicine healthcare intervention, then there will be digital. So let's say it's for a study, then there will be digital forms to complete. Again, it depends sort of on the context. For example, in the European Reference Networks for Rare Diseases, there is actually a standardized consent form that all the ERNs use across Europe. And that is then provided to the patient, and the patient is consenting then for their data to be shared for care purposes. That's, as I said before, that's not the consent to the treatment that has to be done according to each country, but for the data sharing across borders, that's done on a standardized ERN consent form. If you're doing a cross-border digital study where you're collecting data, or well, if you're not seeing the patients, you're only going to be collecting, for example, experiential data, then there are also standardized forms that can be used in that cross-border context. And I don't know whether there's any other element of digital that you wanted to ask about.
Yes, thank you, Petra, for answering to my question and concern at the same time. I was also mainly focusing on the application that the patients may use, like mobile apps, wearable devices, that they start collecting this data. And there's now a lot of concepts developed that this data now the patients can upload it in a platform where then a clinician can use this data to monitor their health condition during the time. So it's just that all this data, the how, the when, the where, this is changing constantly, and I don't know what kind of challenges this would raise.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about treatment that is offered through apps or through devices, whether they're wearable devices or even implanted devices, well, implanted devices is slightly different. If it's a wearable device or an app device, the consent to using that device and collecting the data through it, that will be part of the process, part of the healthcare process. So in some countries, there will be a specific consent to be signed when a device is used, but the baseline of what is required will actually be part of the medical device certification that comes with the app or the device, if the app is a medical device. Not all apps are necessarily medical devices. But yeah, that we do also need to talk about medical device regulation.
Okay, thank you so much.
I see that Vitali has written a reflection in the chat. I'm going to read it out loud. Consent touches many fields: data, participation in clinical trials, intervention, etc. Doesn't it seem that a consent form should have the simplest possible form? And at the same time, when a patient, for example, gives consent for surgery, are we really sure that he or she understands the consequences? agreeing to. Moreover, in the case of surgery, the patient is unable to withdraw their consent once the procedure has begun. And next one, we mention only written form. It needs to take into account possibility to sign or accept agreement or consent in electronic form. I don't know if anyone would like to.
Yeah, I mean, just jumping in very quickly there. Legally, whether something is a wet signature or a electronic signature, legally that's the same. Not everybody, of course, has a certified electronic signature, but the European law on the various laws around data, and including the e-signature law, make it clear that an electronic signature has the same legal value as a handwritten signature. So that shouldn't be an issue.
And Elena is also asking, the difference between informed consent and GDPR consent is not 100% clear to me. So the GDPR does not consider or cover informed consent?
The word informed consent that doesn't exist in GDPR. GDPR has two types of consent and explicit consent, consent for ordinary data and explicit consent for healthcare data. And the difference between the consent and explicit consent is the way in which you show that the patient has given their consent. The GDPR does not say consent has to be in writing, but it's quite difficult to demonstrate explicit consent if it's not in writing. But consent can also be by the fact that you are in a place, for example. So if you go into say you go into an event run by Eurodis or run in the European Parliament, and there is a notice on the door that says we will be filming this this event. If you do not wish to be filmed, please do not attend the event. Therefore, if you are going in, you're attending the event, you are consenting to be filmed. It's more difficult to do that in a healthcare setting, but the words, the informed bit of informed consent exists in GDPR in that you have to tell a data subject, might be a patient, might not be a patient, what you're going to do with the data. So informed consent is required in GDPR because people have to know what is going to happen with their data, but the label informed consent is not actually used in GDPR. But remember that when we're talking about healthcare, GDPR is only about the data part. It's not about consenting to a treatment or to being part of a clinical trial.
If I may add my 2 cents, so with the reference to the electronic consent, we need to be aware that it is not legally accepted in each member states. So it can be difficult to have, for example, the implementation of electronic consent if we have multinational studies where it is not legally accepted by all member states, and we also need to consider the burden for the patients to provide consent and refresh consent electronically. We also need to consider that there is not the direct liaison with the doctor for the electronic consent, and there is also the challenge of verifying the identity of the patients or the parents' legal representatives in case of electronic consent. With reference to the differences between informed consent for the research and the GDPR, we need to know that we need to provide provide consent for the processing of personal data, including the use of personal data, the sharing, the disclosure, and so on. But we also need to provide consent as ethical principle for participating in the research, and according, for example, to the Declaration of Helsinki, but also to the clinical trial regulation. So this is the main difference between the two consent. And we need to know also that the processing of personal data can be also made with other legal bases that are not consent. As explained by Petra, there are different legal bases under which we can use the data, for example, the vital interest and other legal bases, public interest, and so on. And while the informed consent for the research is always to be obtained by the participants in a clinical trial.
Yeah, thank you, Annalisa. Are there any other questions? If not, I'll think we can finish here. Okay, I don't see any further questions. All right, I just want to thank you, Annalisa and Petra and Emanuela, for presenting today. It's been a great presentation, very interesting, and with a lot of resources that you've showed us. I just want to thank you for joining us today, and also all the participants who stayed until the end. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you on June 13 for the 10th webinar of this series about AI for rare diseases care. Very interesting. And yeah, have a great day, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your presentations.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.